Joining us now live from our Parliament office in Wellington is the Health Minister, David Clark. Thanks for being with us, Minister. We really appreciate it.
Good evening, John.
What's your take on this?
Oh, look, it is really disappointing. This is the largest offer to nurses in over a decade. You heard in that package $500 million. The first offer that was put forward, that was supported by the nurses organisation, was higher than the average offer under the previous government. We've since come up with some more money from central government to support the DHBs and doubled that offer, and it's been rejected again by the nurses. I am slightly encouraged that both the nurses organisation and the DHB are publicly saying that they will do everything they can to avoid strike action, facilitation or mediation. But it's a struggle to know exactly what would turn that around, and at this point I think the DHB will be all ears to hear if there's a different way that package can be structured to meet nurses' needs.
You referred to the previous government. That you wouldn't regard that as much of a benchmark. You've spent many nights on Checkpoint over the past couple of years telling us the previous government has bled that sector dry. Now, Michael Woodhouse has issued a statement saying you promised the world. Did nurses have a reasonable expectation that this government would be more generous than the last?
I think 9 years of underfunding have built up a case for nurses being paid better. Nobody would deny that. And doubling what was already better than the average offer under the previous government goes some way towards that. Of course, we're going to have to phase things. We've committed to being a fiscally responsible government that actually prepares for external shocks and natural events like earthquakes or M. bovis. So our hands are tied to that extent. We have put everything in that we can put in, and we have to look if there's another way through this or a different way the nurses would like to carve up that settlement. Although we do want to take seriously those patient safety concerns and make sure that we are increasing the numbers in the workforce. We've committed to keeping that regardless, because we think we need to make sure that nursing organisations are better staffed overall.
You're talking about the nurses, and we've been speaking to them today, and we're going to play you a 50-second grab from one of them now, a woman called Sally Ikavuka, who has been a nurse for about 3 or 4 years. Now, for her, it's not just the money. It's being overworked, it's pressure on the wards, it's staff shortages. I asked her it's a quick grab, but I think she kind of sums it up in a nutshell. This is her typical working day.
So a working day consists of coming to the ward and actually seeing if we're fully staffed, which is every shift of every day is not happening. We're always short. We're always asking nurses to pick up extra shifts. We give our 150% to care for the loved ones of New Zealand, and we're staying overtime, not getting paid for the overtime that we're spending, and the offer of only an extra 500 nurses for all of New Zealand isn't good enough to cover district nurses, public health nurses, hospital nurses, midwives. We're losing so many nurses overseas, it's ridiculous, and we're losing qualified nurses who could be teaching the next generation of nurses, but they're going overseas because they can't afford to live in New Zealand.
So, Minister, there is a sense that money is part of it, but that they are exhausted, up against it, under-resourced, and leaving when they can.
John, you will have heard lots of stories like that, and as have I in opposition. I think that's absolutely real. I heard plenty of stories of nurses running, all the time on wards, from patients who say the nurse was running literally the whole time on shift. And that's why we have committed to that extra staffing, 2% of the workforce increase, an extra 500 nurses, and we're committed to doing that anyway. We've decided that care and safety concern needs to be heard regardless of what the settlement is. Of course, we'd always like to give more, and we'd like to value nurses more. The reality is that every New Zealander knows that nurses work incredibly hard, and that they are people deserving of increases. The negotiation, obviously at this stage between the DHB and the nurses, has not succeeded, but we're open to looking if there are different ways of putting that package together to make sure that the nurses organisation as a whole is happy with it.
There does seem to be good faith bargaining on both sides, and clearly the DHBs and the nurses are both saying we do not want to strike. Do you think that kind of industrial action can be avoided now?
Well, look, I remain hopeful. And I have to say, even in the eventuality of strike action, I've been really impressed by the reports I've had of the constructive way that the nurses and the DHBs are working together on contingency planning, on ensuring that life-preserving services are in place and so on. So the good faith you describe is very real. Everybody, I guess, who works in the health system is concerned for the people they serve, for the public patient, and I want to congratulate them on continuing to be constructive, even in what is a very difficult situation.
Thanks, Minister. We really appreciate you joining us. Just before you go, we spoke to you an enormous amount about Jonathan Coleman and the relationship between the Minister, the Ministry and DHBs. And I just want to briefly ask you about Rabin Rabindran, who was the chair of the Counties Manukau DHB and who's been on Checkpoint now. Were you trying to shut him up or silence him or do the kind of thing that you were criticising the previous government for doing? When you talked about a dignified exit for him from the Counties Manukau DHB, what were you talking about?
Yeah, absolutely not trying to silence him or any of those other accusations that have been labelled. I think anyone that listens to the full recording of that voicemail, and I'll point out that our officers sent that out broadly because we want people to listen to the whole recording, will see nothing that isn't kind or gracious in there. Mr Rabindran had already been given notice that his time serving on that board was up, but he'd raised concerns with me about his professional reputation and wanting to make sure it was preserved, and one of the suggestions I came up with was that perhaps I would indicate to media if I was asked that I'd be prepared to consider him for other positions. I obviously was concerned about the underfunding situation that we both inherited and didn't want him to come out looking bad or to have his reputation damaged or dragged through the media. And unfortunately this latest episode looks like it is taking him through the media again. That certainly was not my intention. I wanted Mr Rabindran to have a gracious exit if at all possible.
David Clark, Health Minister, joining us live from our gallery office. Thank you very much indeed, Minister, for your time.